Deep within the shadowed halls of a 13th century monastery, a physician bent over a glass flask, bringing it close to his face. The amber liquid inside caught the candlelight, refracting through the curved vessel in ways that seemed almost magical. But the physician wasn't admiring the beauty of the light. He was preparing to do something that would make most modern people recoil in disgust. He was about to taste his patient's urine. This wasn't the act of a charlatan or a madman. This was standard medical practice performed by the most educated and respected healers of the age. And urine tasting was just the beginning. To understand medieval medicine is to enter a world where physicians regularly consumed powdered mummies, where they prescribed stones pulled from animal stomachs as universal antidotes to poison, where they administered mercury in doses high enough to make their patients' teeth fall out and their gums ulcerate, where they concocted elaborate medicines from the flesh of vipers, believing that consuming the serpent would protect against its venom. The medieval medical world operated on principles that seem utterly alien to us today. Yet these weren't random superstitions practiced by ignorant people fumbling in the dark. Medieval medicine was built on centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed down from the ancient Greeks and Romans, refined by Arab and Persian scholars, and adapted by European physicians who genuinely believed they were practicing the most advanced science of their time. The substances they consumed, the diagnoses they made, the treatments they prescribed, all of these made perfect sense within the intellectual framework of their age. To truly understand why medieval doctors did what they did, we need to step back and examine the foundations of their medical worldview. We need to understand the theory that underpinned virtually every medical decision made in Europe for nearly 2,000 years. We need to understand the four humours. Picture the medieval cosmos as they understood it. Everything in existence was composed of four fundamental elements: earth, water, air, and fire. These elements weren't just building blocks of matter, they were principles that governed all of creation, from the movements of the stars to the functioning of the human body. Each element possessed two qualities. Earth was cold and dry, water was cold and wet, air was hot and wet, and fire was hot and dry. The human body, as a microcosm of the larger universe, reflected this same structure. Within each person flowed four vital fluids, each corresponding to one of the elements. Blood, associated with air, was hot and wet. Yellow bile, linked to fire, was hot and dry. Black bile, connected to earth, was cold and dry. And phlegm, corresponding to water, was cold and wet. These were the four humours, and they were believed to control everything about a person: their physical health, their appearance, their personality, even their destiny. In a perfectly healthy individual, these four humours existed in a state of balance. But balance didn't mean equal amounts. Each person had their own unique humoral constitution, determined by factors like their age, their sex, the climate they lived in, the season of the year, even the position of the stars at their birth. A young man in the springtime might naturally have more blood than an elderly woman in winter. This was normal and expected. Disease occurred when this delicate balance was disrupted. Too much blood made a person feverish and red-faced. An excess of yellow bile caused rage and jaundice. Black bile in abundance led to melancholy and constipation. Surplus phlegm resulted in sluggishness and a pale, cold complexion. The physician's task was to diagnose which humour was out of balance, and then restore equilibrium through whatever means necessary. The treatments flowing from this theory shaped every aspect of medieval medical practice. If a patient had too much blood, the obvious solution was bloodletting, using leeches or lancets to drain away the excess. If someone suffered from an overabundance of other humours, physicians prescribed purgatives to induce vomiting or diarrhoea, thereby expelling the troublesome fluids. They recommended specific foods based on their humoral qualities: hot and dry foods to counter cold and wet conditions, moist and cooling foods to balance hot and dry temperaments. This wasn't merely theory debated in university halls. It was practical medicine that governed the daily lives of millions. A person with a choleric temperament, dominated by yellow bile, was advised to avoid hot, spicy foods and to seek cool, shady environments. Someone of a phlegmatic disposition needed warming foods and vigorous exercise to heat their sluggish constitution. The theory penetrated so deeply into medieval culture that it shaped language itself. We still call someone sanguine when they're optimistic, choleric when they're irritable, melancholic when they're depressed, and phlegmatic when they're calm, all terms derived directly from humoral medicine. The system's internal logic was compelling. It explained why people got sick in certain seasons, because seasonal changes affected the balance of humours. It explained why treatments sometimes worked, because they were genuinely restoring balance, at least in theory. It even explained why the same treatment might work for one person, but not another, because each individual's humoral constitution was unique. Arab and Persian physicians like Avicenna had refined and expanded the classical Greek theories, creating an even more sophisticated system. By the time this knowledge reached medieval Europe through Latin translations, it had become extraordinarily complex. Physicians studied thick tomes describing how different humours interacted, how they could transform into one another, how they moved through the body, and how they responded to countless different treatments. The Catholic Church embraced humoral theory because it aligned well with Christian doctrine. The idea that the body was a divinely ordered system, that health came from maintaining the balance God had ordained, fit perfectly with medieval theology. Even the concept of treating disease through purification, bleeding away corrupted blood, purging away poisonous humours, resonated with religious ideas about purifying the soul. But humoral theory had a significant problem. How could a physician actually determine which humours were out of balance? You couldn't simply look inside the body to check. The humours were fluids that moved and mixed in complex ways. Medieval physicians needed a window into the body's internal workings, a way to diagnose humoral imbalances without cutting the patient open. They found their answer in urine. The urine wheel was a marvel of medieval medical technology. Imagine a circular diagram divided into 20 sections, each showing a glass flask filled with liquid of a different colour. Pale straw yellow, deep amber, reddish brown, greenish tint, cloudy white. Each colour corresponded to a specific disease or imbalance of the humours. Around the circle ran lines connecting each flask to detailed descriptions of symptoms, prognoses, and recommended treatments. These wheels weren't primitive guesswork. They represented centuries of accumulated observations about the connections between urine appearance and various ailments. Physicians who mastered the urine wheel could allegedly diagnose a patient's condition simply by examining their urine, without ever meeting the patient face to face. The practice became so prestigious that the urine flask itself became the universal symbol of the medical profession, appearing in countless medieval paintings and manuscripts whenever an artist wanted to depict a physician. The examination process followed a careful ritual. The patient would urinate into a special vessel called a matula, a clear glass flask with a rounded bottom and a long, narrow neck. The neck was crucial because it allowed the physician to hold the flask up to the light without contaminating the sample with his fingers. The rounded bottom was equally important because it allowed sediment to settle, creating distinct layers that the physician could analyse. A skilled physician examined urine through multiple senses. First came visual inspection. He held the matula up to natural light, preferably near a window, rotating it slowly to observe every aspect of the liquid. Colour was paramount. Was it pale or dark, clear or cloudy? But colour wasn't everything. The physician looked for sediment patterns, for particles floating in the liquid, for foamy bubbles at the surface. He noted the urine's consistency, thin and watery or thick and syrupy. Then came smell. The physician brought the flask close to his nose, sniffing carefully. Sweet smells might indicate one condition, foul odours another. The intensity of the smell mattered as much as its character. A faint odour suggested one diagnosis, an overwhelming stench quite another. And then, for some physicians, came the most intimate part of the examination. They tasted the urine itself. The practice of tasting urine strikes modern sensibilities as almost incomprehensibly disgusting. But to medieval physicians working within the framework of humoral theory, it made perfect sense. The humours each had distinctive tastes, just as they had distinctive colours and textures. Blood was sweet, as anyone who has tasted their own blood from a cut-lip knows. Black bile was sour and acidic. Yellow bile was bitter, as anyone who has vomited on an empty stomach can attest. These weren't abstract theoretical qualities. They were real, observable characteristics that a physician could detect. A patient suffering from an excess of blood would have sweet-tasting urine. Someone with too much bile would produce bitter urine. The taste test provided information that visual and olfactory examination alone couldn't reveal. It was diagnostic data, as valuable in its way as modern blood test results. The practice had ancient precedent. Arab physicians like Rhazes and Avicenna had recommended urine tasting in their influential medical texts. When these works were translated into Latin and spread throughout medieval Europe, European physicians adopted the practice, though perhaps not as enthusiastically as their Middle Eastern colleagues. Most European physicians preferred to rely primarily on colour and smell, resorting to taste only when necessary for difficult diagnoses. But taste testing had one major practical advantage. It helped physicians detect fraud. Because uroscopy became so prestigious, and because it allowed diagnosis without seeing the patient, some people tried to cheat. Skeptical patients would test their physician's abilities by sending samples of white wine or other yellow liquids instead of urine. A physician who casually tasted the sample would immediately detect the deception, maintaining their professional credibility. One famous story from around the year 1000 tells of the Duke of Bavaria, who sought to test the legendary monk physician Notker. The Duke secretly obtained a urine sample not from himself but from a pregnant servant girl, then sent it to Notker for diagnosis. The physician examined the sample carefully and declared that the Duke would soon give birth. When the truth came out, Notker's reputation was enhanced rather than damaged. He had diagnosed the pregnancy correctly, even though he'd been given false information about whose urine he was examining. Medical texts provided detailed instructions for interpreting urine characteristics. White, thin urine indicated an abundance of phlegm and suggested a cold, wet imbalance. Red, thick urine pointed to excess blood or yellow bile, a hot condition requiring cooling treatments. Black or very dark urine was particularly ominous, suggesting an accumulation of black bile that could indicate serious illness or even approaching death. Green-tinged urine revealed corruption of the humours, possibly indicating poisoning or severe internal disease. The timing of urine production mattered too. Normal healthy urine was said to be white in the morning and redder after meals, reflecting the body's digestive processes and the natural circulation of the humours throughout the day. If someone's urine remained the same colour all day, that consistency itself was a diagnostic sign pointing to humoral stagnation. Sediment in the urine received particularly close scrutiny. Clear urine was rarely a good sign. It suggested the body wasn't properly cooking and digesting the humours. Physicians expected to see some sediment, but its character and quantity had to be right. Too little sediment indicated incomplete digestion. Too much suggested corruption. The sediment's appearance revealed which organs were affected and which humours were involved in the disease process. One physician recorded his diagnosis method with mathematical precision. He claimed to distinguish between 20 different types of urine based on colour alone, with each type indicating different conditions and requiring different treatments. Other physicians went even further, claiming they could diagnose pregnancy, determine the sex of an unborn child, predict the course of a fever, and even forecast whether a patient would live or die, all from examining urine. The English physician Thomas Willis made one of the most significant medical discoveries in history through urine tasting. In 1674, Willis noted that some patients produced urine that tasted wonderfully sweet, as if it had been imbued with honey or sugar. These patients also displayed characteristic symptoms: excessive thirst, constant urination, unexplained weight loss, and eventual wasting away. Willis connected these symptoms with the sweet urine and identified what we now call diabetes mellitus. The term mellitus means honeyed or sweetened with honey, a direct reference to Willis's observation about urine taste. For centuries afterward, diabetes was known as Willis's disease. This discovery highlights an important point. Medieval medical practices, strange as they seem to us, sometimes led to genuine medical insights. Willis's willingness to taste urine, bizarre as that practice appears, allowed him to make a connection that purely theoretical medicine might have missed. The empirical observation, this patient's urine tastes sweet, led to the identification of a distinct disease entity. But uroscopy's prestige eventually became a liability. As the practice grew more popular, it attracted charlatans who claimed diagnostic abilities they didn't possess. Patients began to expect physicians to diagnose everything from urine alone, without bothering with physical examination or taking a medical history. Some physicians went along with this, making dramatic pronouncements based on brief glances at urine samples, trying to impress patients with their seemingly magical abilities. Responsible physicians pushed back against these excesses. They wrote treatises condemning the piss prophets and urine doctors who brought the profession into disrepute. Isaac Israeli, a respected medieval physician, openly criticised colleagues who tried to diagnose patients they had never met, calling them fools who would base prophecies on urine without seeing the patient and determine what disease is present and whether the patient will die. The problem reached such extremes that some physicians launched organised campaigns against irresponsible uroscopy. They derided practitioners who relied solely on urine examination as deceitful piss-mongers who were prostituting their medical knowledge for easy money. These critics argued that true medicine required thorough patient examination, careful consideration of symptoms, and thoughtful analysis, not quick judgments based on glancing at a flask. Despite these criticisms, uroscopy remained a cornerstone of medical practice throughout the medieval period and well into the modern era. Even in the 19th century, physicians still routinely examined urine colour and clarity as part of their diagnostic toolkit. The practice only truly faded when chemical analysis of urine began in the late 1800s, providing far more accurate information about the body's internal chemistry than visual inspection ever could. But while physicians were examining urine samples, they were also prescribing substances far stranger than anything excreted by the body. They were recommending that their patients consume the dead. The word itself sounds sinister, Mumia. To medieval and Renaissance Europeans, it meant medicine. Specifically, it meant a pharmaceutical preparation made from human corpses, most famously from Egyptian mummies that had lain in their tombs for thousands of years. For centuries, ground-up mummies were available at apothecaries throughout Europe, prescribed for everything from broken bones to bubonic plague. The practice of consuming human remains as medicine reaches back into classical antiquity and persisted shockingly far into the modern era. The pharmaceutical company Merck was still listing mummy powder in its catalogue as late as 1924. How did this grotesque practice begin? Like many medieval medical traditions, it started with the translation error and a misunderstanding that grew into an entire industry. The story begins in ancient Persia, where physicians had long used a substance called Mumia, a mineral pitch or bitumen that seeped from mountainsides in the region. This black tar-like substance was believed to have powerful healing properties, particularly for broken bones and internal injuries. The name probably derived from the Persian word mum, meaning wax, referring to the substance's consistency. Arab physicians incorporated Mumia into their medical practice, and their texts described its therapeutic virtues in glowing terms. When these Arabic medical works were translated into Latin, and spread throughout medieval Europe, European scholars misunderstood what Mumia actually was. They knew the substance came from the East. They knew it was black and sticky. They knew it was associated with preserved corpses. The confusion was almost inevitable. The ancient Egyptians had used bitumen in their mummification process, coating the wrapped bodies with the dark preservative substance. When Europeans encountered Egyptian mummies, they saw the same black sticky coating that they'd read about in medical texts. They concluded that this was mumia, that the healing substance described by Arab physicians was actually derived from mummified human remains. It was a catastrophic mistranslation with far-reaching consequences. By the 12th century, mumia had become a prized commodity in European markets. Merchants brought powdered mummies from Egypt, selling them to apothecaries who prepared the substance for medical use. Physicians prescribed it for an astonishing range of ailments. An 18th century pharmaceutical treatise by Dr. Robert James lists mumia's uses as a blood thinner, a painkiller, a cough suppressant and an anti-inflammatory. Other sources recommended it for epilepsy, arthritis, paralysis, internal bleeding, poisoning and general weakness. The theoretical justification for consuming mummies reveals fascinating aspects of medieval medical thought. Some physicians believed that mummies retained a sort of spiritual essence or vital force from their former life. This mumia, now meaning the preserved remains themselves rather than the bitumen, contained concentrated life energy that could be transferred to the consumer. Eating the dead was, in this view, a way of absorbing their vitality, their youth, their strength. The Swiss physician and alchemist Paracelsus took this concept even further. Writing in the early 16th century, Paracelsus argued that the human body contained powerful healing properties that could be extracted and used medicinally. He believed that properly prepared human flesh could cure almost any ailment. But Paracelsus dismissed Egyptian mummies as inferior. He insisted that the most potent medicinal mumia came from fresh corpses, specifically from the bodies of young healthy people who had died violent deaths. This led to an even more disturbing development. If fresh corpses were more potent than ancient mummies, why rely on Egyptian sources at all? European practitioners began developing their own recipes for preparing human flesh as medicine. One infamous formula, recorded by the German physician Oswald Kroll, called for obtaining the corpse of a red-haired man around 24 years of age, who had been executed by hanging or broken on the wheel. The body should be left exposed to the moon for a day and night, then cut into pieces, sprinkled with myrrh and aloes, soaked in wine, and dried until it resembled smoke-cured meat. The demand for mummies and corpse medicine created a ghoulish international trade. Body snatchers raided burial grounds throughout Europe and the Middle East, stealing corpses to sell to apothecaries. Executioners made side money selling the bodies of criminals to medical practitioners. In Egypt, an entire industry sprang up around supplying mummies to European merchants. The French physician Ambroise Paré, visiting Egypt in the 16th century, met a merchant who admitted to manufacturing fake mummies from recently deceased people, executed criminals, slaves, pilgrims who had died in the desert. The merchant expressed surprise that Christians would want to eat dead bodies, but business was business. The mummy trade reached truly industrial proportions. In 1586, an English merchant named John Sanderson purchased 600 pounds of mummy in Egypt and shipped it back to London to sell to apothecaries. That's not 600 pounds weight of a few select mummies, that's 600 pounds of ground human remains, hundreds of bodies reduced to powder, destined to be consumed as medicine across England. Different parts of the body supposedly offered different therapeutic benefits. Powdered skull was particularly prized, especially for treating epilepsy and headaches. Human fat was rendered into oils and ointments for joint pain and skin conditions. Blood, particularly if taken from young, healthy individuals who had died violently, was consumed to treat epilepsy and other neurological disorders. Some practitioners claimed that blood needed to be drunk fresh from the scaffold, still warm from the executed person's body, to maintain its full potency. Even royalty participated in corpse medicine. King Francis I of France reportedly carried a mixture of mummy powder and rhubarb with him wherever he travelled, taking it regularly as a preventative medicine. King Charles II of England drank what was known as the King's Drops, a tincture made from human skulls dissolved in alcohol. The reasoning behind this royal remedy held that the concentrated essence of human brain tissue could strengthen mental faculties and prevent apoplexy. Corpse medicine wasn't limited to adults. Parents gave children medicines containing human remains, believing they would protect against childhood diseases. Teething powders sometimes contained skull powder. Wet nurses were advised to consume certain corpse preparations to improve their milk. Pregnant women took powders derived from placental tissue, believing it would ease labour and delivery. Not everyone accepted these practices without question. The same Ambroise Paré who documented the fake mummy trade became one of corpse medicine's fiercest critics. Paré admitted that he had personally prescribed Mumia to more than 100 patients earlier in his career, but he came to believe it was worthless at best and harmful at worst. He condemned this wicked kind of drug and urged his fellow physicians to stop prescribing it, noting that it often caused severe stomach pain, vomiting, and bad breath rather than any therapeutic benefit. Other physicians raised theological objections. Consuming human flesh, even in medicinal form, bore uncomfortable resemblance to cannibalism. Some theologians argued it violated the sanctity of the human body and showed disrespect for the dead. Protestant reformers pointed out the hypocrisy of Catholics who condemned pagan cannibalism while themselves consuming powdered corpses. Catholic apologists responded that consuming mummies for medical purposes was entirely different from ritual cannibalism. One was a practical use of natural substances, the other a barbaric religious practice. Natural philosophers began questioning corpse medicine on empirical grounds. How exactly were the supposed healing properties transmitted from dead flesh to living patient? What mechanism allowed desiccated human tissue to cure disease? As anatomical knowledge improved and physicians developed a better understanding of how the body actually worked, the theoretical justifications for corpse medicine began to crumble. By the 18th century, medical opinion was turning decisively against Mumia. Physicians noted that different apothecaries sold vastly different preparations under the same name, making any consistent therapeutic effect impossible. The variability alone suggested that whatever benefits patients experienced were due to placebo effects, or the natural course of their diseases rather than any actual properties of the mummies themselves. Yet the practice died hard. Apothecaries continued to stock mummy powder through the 19th century, and occasional reports surfaced of people consuming corpse medicine well into the 20th century. A case from 1847 England involved a man advised to feed his epileptic daughter a mixture of skull powder from a young woman mixed with treacle. He obtained the compound and administered it, though apparently without beneficial effect. In 1908, a final documented attempt occurred in Germany when someone tried to drink blood at the scaffold, believing in its curative powers. The persistence of corpse medicine, despite growing skepticism, reveals how powerful medical tradition can be. Once a practice becomes established, once physicians invest their reputations in it, once patients come to expect and demand it, that practice can continue for generations after its theoretical foundations have collapsed. The same dynamic that kept corpse medicine alive for centuries would also sustain other dubious medical practices, including another animal-derived remedy that medieval physicians swore by. In the stomach of a goat grazing on mountainsides in Persia, a peculiar object slowly forms. Over months or years, layers of indigestible material accumulate around a pebble or clump of fibre that the animal has swallowed. Mineral salts from the goat's digestive system gradually coat this core, creating smooth, concentric layers. The stomach's contractions squeeze and polish the growing mass into an ovoid shape. Eventually, the object may reach the size of a pigeon's egg or even larger. This object is a bezoar, and for centuries it was worth its weight in gold many times over. Medieval and Renaissance physicians believed that bezoars possessed nearly magical properties. Most importantly, they were considered universal antidotes capable of neutralizing any poison. A person who had been poisoned could supposedly save themselves simply by scraping some powder from a bezoar stone into wine and drinking it. Merely keeping a bezoar nearby allegedly offered protection against venomous creatures and toxic substances. The wealthy had bezoars set in ornate gold and silver, wearing them as protective amulets or displaying them in cabinets of curiosities. The name Bezoar comes from the Persian padzar, meaning literally counterpoison or antidote. This etymology reveals how the stones were originally understood as a natural defence against poison, a gift of nature to protect against one of medieval life's constant dangers. In an age where assassination by poisoning was a genuine threat to anyone of importance, where accidental poisoning from contaminated food or toxic plants was common, the promise of a universal antidote had immense appeal. Arab physicians had been using bezoars medicinally since at least the 8th century. They brought the practice into European medicine in the 12th century, just as poisoning was becoming an increasingly sophisticated art among European nobility. The timing was not coincidental. As poison became the weapon of choice for political murder, the demand for effective antidotes soared. Bezoars seemed to offer the perfect solution, a natural substance that could counter any toxin, no matter how deadly. The theory behind bezoars' supposed powers connected to several different belief systems. One explanation held that bezoars worked through natural sympathy. The stones came from animals that ate poisonous plants with no ill effects, so they must contain some property that neutralized poisons. Another theory suggested that bezoars possessed a cooling, drying quality that could counteract the hot, wet nature of most poisons. Yet another explanation claimed that bezoars worked through a sort of magnetic attraction, drawing poisons out of the body the way lodestone attracts iron. Legends enhanced bezoars' mystical reputation. Stories told of deer that would eat poisonous snakes, becoming immune to venom, and whose tears would solidify into stone with poison-curing properties. Persian sources described a special kind of mountain goat that fed on toxic herbs, concentrating the antidote properties in stones within their stomachs. These tales blended with genuine observations about how certain animals could consume plants that would kill humans, creating a mythology around bezoars that elevated them from curious natural objects to precious medical treasures. Different types of bezoars existed, and physicians believed each variety had particular strengths. Oriental bezoars, from the mountainous regions of Persia and northern India, were considered the finest and most potent. They came from bezoar goats native to those regions and commanded astronomical prices. Occidental bezoars, from goats and llamas in South America, were regarded as less powerful but still valuable. Physicians also recognized bezoars from other animals, deer, oxen, even porcupines, though goat bezoars remained the gold standard. Using a bezoar involved a specific protocol. For poisoning cases, physicians would scrape a small amount of powder from the stone's surface, typically about the weight of 3 barley grains. This powder would be dissolved in wine, water, or some other liquid, then given to the patient to drink. For other conditions like fever or melancholy, smaller amounts might suffice. Some people kept bezoars in special drinking vessels, believing that any liquid poured into such a cup would be automatically purified of poison. The wealthy and powerful were obsessed with bezoars. Queen Elizabeth I of England had a bezoar set in a silver ring. The Spanish royal family maintained an extensive collection of bezoars, each one carefully catalogued and stored in protective cases. The Medici family of Florence, always conscious of assassination threats, kept multiple bezoars on hand and employed physicians who specialized in their use. When diplomatic gifts were exchanged between royal courts, bezoars frequently featured alongside jewels and precious metals. This demand created the inevitable fraud. Bezoars were so valuable that counterfeiters went to enormous lengths to produce fakes. Some painted ordinary stones to look like bezoars. Others created composite stones from crushed gems, resins, and other materials compressed together. Enterprising criminals might steal genuine bezoars, scrape off the outer layers to sell as powder, then build up new layers with worthless materials before selling the restored stone to an unsuspecting buyer. The legal system recognised bezoar's value. A famous English court case from 1603, Chandeleur versus Lopus, helped establish the legal doctrine of caveat emptor, buyer beware. A man had paid £100, an enormous sum for what he believed was a genuine bezoar stone. When it proved to be counterfeit, he sued the seller. The court ruled against him, establishing that buyers bore responsibility for verifying what they purchased. The case became a landmark in commercial law precisely because it involved a bezoar, an object so valuable that fraud surrounding it merited the highest court's attention. Inevitably, someone decided to actually test whether bezoars worked. That someone was Ambroise Paré, the same French surgeon who had criticised mummy medicine. In 1575, a cook at the royal court was caught stealing silver. He was sentenced to death and given a choice: hanging or participating in a medical experiment. The cook chose the experiment. He would be given poison, then treated with a bezoar. If he survived, he would be freed. The cook swallowed the poison, corrosive sublimate, a mercury compound. Paré promptly administered bezoar powder dissolved in wine. Nothing happened. The cook's condition worsened rapidly. He suffered agonizing abdominal pain, vomiting, and convulsions. 6 hours after taking the poison, despite repeated doses of bezoar, the cook died in terrible pain. His autopsy revealed that his stomach lining had been completely destroyed by the mercury. The bezoar had provided no protection whatsoever. Paré published his results, but they had remarkably little effect on bezoar use. Defenders of the stones argued that the cook had been given an impossibly strong poison, that the bezoar hadn't been of sufficiently high quality, that Paré had administered it incorrectly. The emotional investment in bezoars was too strong to be overcome by mere evidence. People wanted to believe in a universal antidote, and bezoars filled that need too perfectly to be abandoned. Modern chemical analysis has revealed something interesting. When researchers immersed bezoars in arsenic-laced solutions, the stones did absorb some of the poison. The mechanism involves ion exchange in the mineral layers and binding of arsenite to sulfur compounds in the protein components. So bezoars could theoretically provide some protection against arsenic poisoning, though nowhere near the universal antidote properties attributed to them. It's a reminder that folk remedies sometimes have kernels of genuine therapeutic activity, even when the theoretical explanations are completely wrong. But bezoars were just one of many animal-derived medicines in the medieval pharmacopoeia. Physicians also prescribed preparations made from snakes, the very creatures whose venom bezoars supposedly countered. These snake medicines were based on a principle that would seem completely backward to us: consuming poison could cure poison. The most famous of these preparations was theriac, a complex compound that had been famous since ancient times. The preparation allegedly originated with King Mithridates VI of Pontus, a ruler so paranoid about assassination that he experimented on prisoners to develop antidotes. After testing various substances, Mithridates created a compound containing dozens of ingredients that he took daily to protect himself against poisoning. When he was finally defeated in war and tried to commit suicide by taking poison, the poison supposedly had no effect. His antidote regimen had made him immune. Roman physicians captured Mithridates' medical notes and began developing their own versions of his antidote. The physician Andromachus, serving Emperor Nero in the 1st century CE, improved the formula by bringing the ingredient count to 64 and adding a crucial new component: viper flesh. The reasoning followed a strange logic that made sense in the medical thinking of the time. Venomous snakes must have some innate property that protected them from their own venom. If you consumed snake flesh, you could transfer that protective quality to yourself. Poison from the serpent would cure poison. The process of making theriac was elaborate and public. In major Italian cities, the preparation of theriac became an official ceremony attended by physicians, apothecaries, and civic officials. The event took place over weeks, with ingredients carefully measured, mixed, and fermented under official supervision. The finished product would age for years. According to Galen's recommendations, theriac reached peak potency after 6 years and remained effective for 40. The ingredients list read like an inventory of a medieval spice merchant's dreams. Cinnamon, ginger, cardamom, frankincense, myrrh, saffron, opium for pain relief, various roots and herbs. Sometimes even mummy powder was included, but at the heart of every proper theriac recipe was viper flesh. Live vipers would be captured, their heads and tails cut off, their bodies skinned and cleaned. The flesh would be boiled, then dried and ground into powder. This powder formed the active ingredient around which all other components were arranged. Theriac was prescribed for an astonishing range of conditions. Obviously it was used for snake bites and poisoning, but physicians also recommended it for plague, for tuberculosis, for digestive complaints, for fever, for melancholy, for sexual dysfunction. It became the most expensive and prestigious medicine available, the pharmaceutical equivalent of fine wine. Wealthy patients took it regularly as a preventative. Pharmacies displayed ornate jars of theriac as proof of their quality and sophistication. The preparation travelled far beyond Europe. Through trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to Asia, theriac recipes reached India, Persia, and eventually China. Each culture adapted the formula to local ingredients and medical theories, but the core concept remained: a complex antidote centered on snake flesh. The Jesuits manufactured an artificial version called Goa stones in their mission stations in India, combining crushed gems, resins, and herbal ingredients into hardened balls that could be scraped to produce powder when needed. Theriac's persistence is remarkable. It remained in official pharmacopoeias well into the 19th century. Italian pharmacies sold theriac as late as 1930. Part of its longevity stemmed from the opium content, which genuinely provided pain relief and made patients feel better, reinforcing belief in the medicine's overall effectiveness. Part came from its enormous complexity. With dozens of ingredients, failures could always be blamed on poor quality components or incorrect preparation rather than flaws in the concept itself. But eventually, as with corpse medicine and Bezoars, scientific scrutiny undermined theriac. Physicians pointed out that different preparations called theriac had wildly varying compositions. Chemical analysis found no consistent active principles. Controlled experiments showed no benefit beyond what opium alone provided. The elaborate ceremony and long-aging process began to seem like theatre, designed to justify high prices rather than genuine pharmaceutical necessity. Yet even as these animal remedies faded from use, another category of medical consumption persisted, one that would prove even more dangerous than powdered mummies or snake flesh. Physicians weren't just prescribing organic materials, they were administering heavy metals, particularly one that had been used in medicine for centuries and would continue to poison patients well into the 20th century. Picture a 16th century treatment room. A syphilitic patient sits naked on a stool inside a wooden box, only his head protruding through an opening in the top. Below him, on a platform of hot coals, a brick of cinnabar, naturally occurring mercury sulfide, slowly heats, releasing toxic mercury vapours that rise around the patient's body. The patient breathes in the fumes, absorbs them through his skin, and suffers. His gums swell and ulcerate. His teeth loosen in their sockets. He salivates uncontrollably, producing literally pints of thick saliva that he must constantly spit out. He develops tremors. His personality changes, becoming irritable and anxious. His mouth fills with a metallic taste that never goes away. But the physicians overseeing this torture believe they're curing him. The excessive salivation is a good sign, they insist. It means the mercury is working, drawing out the corrupted humours that cause syphilis. The patient must continue the treatment until he has produced sufficient saliva, at least 3 pints, according to some recommendations. Only then can they be confident that the disease has been expelled from his body. Mercury had been used medicinally for centuries before syphilis appeared in Europe. Ancient physicians prescribed it for skin conditions, especially leprosy. Arab and Persian doctors incorporated it into their pharmaceutical arsenals. But mercury use exploded after syphilis began spreading through Europe in the late 1490s. This new disease terrified people. It progressed through horrible stages, first genital sores, then a rash covering the entire body, then the appearance of gummy lesions that could eat away flesh and bone, and finally neurological deterioration ending in madness and death. Physicians desperately sought treatments. They tried guaiacum wood imported from the Americas, reasoning that if syphilis came from the New World, God must have provided a cure there as well. Guaiacum showed no real effectiveness, but mercury seemed different. When physicians treated syphilis patients with mercury, something appeared to happen. The sores would dry up. The rash would fade. Patients felt that powerful forces were at work inside their bodies, expelling the disease. The Swiss physician Paracelsus championed mercury treatment, though he recognized its toxicity and tried to develop safer formulations. He recommended applying mercury as an ointment rather than administering it as an elixir, reducing but not eliminating the poisonous effects. Other physicians developed elaborate fumigation methods, having patients inhale mercury vapours in enclosed spaces. Some prescribed mercury pills, small spheres of metallic mercury mixed with other ingredients and compressed into tablets that patients would swallow. The reality was grimmer than physicians acknowledged. Mercury is profoundly toxic to the human nervous system, kidneys, and immune system. The symptoms that physicians interpreted as signs of successful treatment were actually symptoms of mercury poisoning. The excessive salivation, the gum disease, the tooth loss, the tremors, the psychological changes, all were caused by mercury-destroying tissue throughout the body. Many patients died not from syphilis but from the mercury used to treat it. A popular saying emerged: a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Sexual encounters risked syphilis infection, which then meant months or years of toxic mercury treatment. The phrase captured both the connection between sex and disease and the prolonged suffering that mercury therapy entailed. Some patients underwent mercury treatment for years, developing such severe neurological damage that they could barely function. The condition had its own name, mercurial erethism, characterized by excessive shyness, anxiety, memory loss, and uncontrollable trembling. Hatmakers developed a particularly notorious form of mercury poisoning. The felting process used in hat manufacturing employed mercury compounds, and workers who spent years inhaling mercury fumes often developed severe neurological symptoms. They became irritable, anxious, and socially withdrawn. They developed tremors that interfered with their work, hence the phrase "mad as a hatter." Hatmakers were known for their eccentric, sometimes bizarre behaviour, a direct consequence of chronic mercury exposure. Despite all this, mercury remained the standard treatment for syphilis for centuries. Several factors explain this persistence. First, syphilis has a peculiar natural history. It causes acute symptoms initially, then enters a latent phase where symptoms disappear or become less severe. This latency could last years or even decades. When patients improved after mercury treatment, physicians credited the mercury, not realizing that the disease had simply entered its dormant phase. Second, mercury does have some antimicrobial properties. It may have actually killed some of the syphilis bacteria during the disease's early stages, though not enough to cure the infection. This partial effect would have been enough to convince physicians that their treatment worked. especially given their limited diagnostic capabilities. Third, the humoral theory framework made mercury seem logical. Mercury was hot and dry. Syphilis was believed to involve corrupted humours that were cold and wet. Mercury should therefore balance those humours, restoring health. The excessive salivation that mercury caused fitted perfectly into this scheme. The mercury was clearly forcing the body to expel corrupted fluids, purging away disease. Mercury came in various formulations, each with its own uses and devotees. Calomel, or mercurous chloride, became particularly popular from the 16th through 19th centuries. It was marketed as a cure for nearly everything: constipation, parasitic infections, fever, melancholy, even teething pain in infants. The wide availability of calomel meant that mercury poisoning became common across all social classes. Even famous figures suffered its effects. Abraham Lincoln took calomel pills for his chronic melancholy, and some historians believe the mercury contributed to the mood swings and irritability noted by his contemporaries. Blue mass pills, made from metallic mercury mixed with licorice extract and other ingredients, were another popular mercury preparation. The pills got their name from their distinctive greyish-blue colour. Physicians prescribed them for an absurdly broad range of complaints. A typical daily dose of 2 or 3 blue mass pills contained over 100 times the mercury exposure that modern safety standards would permit. Yet millions of people took them regularly throughout the 19th century. The use of mercury for syphilis continued even after better alternatives became available. In 1910, the Japanese researcher Sahachiro Hata, working in Paul Ehrlich's laboratory, developed Salvarsan, the first effective antimicrobial treatment for syphilis. Salvarsan worked far better than mercury and had fewer side effects, though it was still quite toxic. Yet many physicians continued prescribing mercury alongside or instead of Salvarsan, citing tradition and their own experience. Only when penicillin became available in the 1940s did mercury treatment for syphilis finally end. Other metals also found their way into medicine. Gold compounds were used to treat arthritis and other inflammatory conditions. Antimony preparations served as expectorants and emetics, inducing vomiting that physicians interpreted as purging corrupted humours. Lead, though recognised as poisonous by ancient writers, appeared in various medicines, particularly cosmetics and complexion remedies. Arsenic compounds, later marketed under names like Fowler's solution, were prescribed for skin conditions and as general tonics. These metal-based medicines reflect a broader pattern in historical medicine. When physicians couldn't explain how the body worked, when they lacked effective treatments for serious diseases, they turned to dramatic interventions that produced obvious effects. If a medicine made you vomit, made you salivate, made you purge, well, something powerful must be happening. The medicine must be working. The fact that these dramatic effects were symptoms of poisoning rather than signs of healing wasn't understood or was rationalized away within theoretical frameworks that made toxicity seem therapeutic. Standing here in the 21st century, looking back at physicians tasting urine, consuming powdered corpses, administering snake flesh, and poisoning patients with mercury, it's tempting to feel superior. How could they have been so foolish? How could educated people believe such obviously wrong theories? How could medical practice persist for centuries despite doing more harm than good? But that judgment is too simple and too harsh. Medieval physicians were working with the intellectual tools available to them. They inherited theories from the Greeks and Romans, theories that seemed to explain observations and appear to work in practice. They refined these theories, tested them within their own framework, and transmitted them to students who studied for years to master this complex body of knowledge. They weren't fools or charlatans. They were intelligent people trying to heal the sick with the best understanding their age could provide. Some medieval practices even led to genuine medical advances. Thomas Willis's discovery that diabetic patients had sweet-tasting urine, made through uroscopy, helped identify diabetes as a distinct disease. The practice of examining urine ultimately evolved into modern urinalysis, which remains a valuable diagnostic tool. Medieval anatomical studies, conducted partly to understand where humours originated and flowed, laid groundwork for later discoveries about circulation and organ function. The pharmaceutical industry itself grew out of medieval and Renaissance apothecaries who prepared complex medicines like theriac. These practitioners developed expertise in sourcing ingredients, standardizing preparations, and documenting effects. Their methods for quality control, record keeping, and formulation directly influenced modern pharmaceutical practices. Even the research methods that eventually disproved medieval theories, systematic observation, careful documentation, willingness to question authority, had roots in medieval university culture. We also shouldn't assume that modern medicine is immune to similar errors. Throughout the 20th century, physicians prescribed lobotomies for mental illness, irradiated children's tonsils, gave pregnant women thalidomide, recommended smoking for respiratory health. Looking back, these practices seem as barbaric as bloodletting or corpse medicine. Future. Generations will likely view some of our current medical practices with equal horror. What matters is the willingness to question, to test, to revise understanding when evidence demands it. That process accelerated during the scientific revolution as physicians began systematic anatomical dissection, as chemists analysed what medicines actually contained, as clinicians started comparing treated and untreated patients to see if therapies actually worked. The shift from theoretical medicine to empirical medicine took centuries and wasn't completed until relatively recently. The story of medieval medicine isn't really about how ignorant our ancestors were. It's about how hard it is to understand the world, how strongly we cling to frameworks that seem to explain our observations, how long it takes for new evidence to overcome established practice. It's about the courage required to say that centuries of tradition are wrong, that respected authorities were mistaken, that we need to start over with different assumptions. Every time a physician tasted urine, believing they were diagnosing humoral imbalances through empirical observation, they were participating in the scientific process. They were wrong about what they were observing, wrong about how the body worked, wrong about what constituted treatment, but they were trying to base medical practice on observation rather than pure speculation. That impulse, to look at what actually happens rather than just theorizing, eventually led to real medicine. When Ambroise Paré tested whether Bezoars actually worked as antidotes, conducting an actual experiment rather than just consulting authorities, he was helping to create the scientific method. When physicians began noticing that patients often died from mercury treatment rather than from syphilis, and when they had the courage to question whether the treatment made sense, they were demonstrating the self-correcting nature of science. Medieval medical practices remind us that intelligence and education don't protect against error, that prestigious institutions can be completely wrong, that the most respected experts can be teaching nonsense, that therapeutic tradition can persist long after it should have been abandoned. These are uncomfortable lessons, but they're important ones. They should make us humble about our own medical certainty and sceptical of claims that can't be tested. The medieval physician examining urine flasks, the Renaissance apothecary grinding mummies into powder, the early modern doctor administering mercury fumes, they weren't monsters. They were healers trying their best with inadequate knowledge. They were people, like us, doing what they thought was right based on the understanding of their time. We honour them best not by mocking their errors, but by learning from them, by maintaining the questioning spirit that eventually corrected those errors, by remembering that future generations will likely look back at us with similar amazement at our blindness. Medicine has come a staggering distance from those days when physicians believed in humours and prescribed powdered corpses. We understand disease at the molecular level. We can cure infections that would have killed medieval patients in days. We can transplant organs, map genomes, engineer antibodies. The transformation is extraordinary. But it happened because countless physicians over centuries were willing to question tradition, to test assumptions, to abandon cherished theories when evidence demanded it. That process continues today. Medical knowledge evolves constantly, sometimes overturning what seemed certain just years earlier. The physicians of the future will look back at us and see errors we can't yet recognize. They'll wonder why we did certain things, prescribed certain drugs, followed certain protocols, and they'll be right to wonder. We're not at the end of medical progress any more than medieval physicians were. We're just further along the same road, the road from ignorance toward understanding. The difference between us and medieval physicians isn't that we're smarter or better educated in some absolute sense. It's that we've inherited centuries of accumulated knowledge built on the work of all those who came before, including those medieval physicians who tasted urine and prescribed mummy powder. They were part of the long, messy, gradual process through which humanity learned to heal. Their errors taught lessons as valuable as their successes, and those lessons continue to guide medicine today, reminding us to question, to test, to remain humble before the complexity of the human body. So the next time you read about some new medical controversy, some debate about treatments or theories, remember those medieval physicians. Remember that certainty is dangerous, that expertise can be mistaken, that progress requires questioning. Remember that medicine is not a collection of eternal truths, but an ongoing process of discovery, correction, and refinement. And remember to be grateful that you live in an age when doctors no longer taste urine, prescribe corpse powder, or administer mercury vapours, while recognizing that future generations will likely feel similar gratitude that they don't live in our time. If you found this journey through medieval medicine fascinating, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more bizarre and amazing stories from history waiting to be explored, and your support helps me keep bringing them to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.